Con delegate was the first post that Coleman Young ever got elected to. Tell us about Coleman.
Yeah, there's a lot. This is very interesting that Coleman was in the fight in the Wayne County Council. He was in the left wing. Now, I'm not saying he was a member of the Communist Party, because the left wing, they had control of it. And if everyone there had been a communist, they'd had overwhelming majority. Well, Coleman ran for Con. I think the Detroit News in particular said he was a communist and shouldn't be elected. Well, there are not many people in his district that read the Detroit News, let alone followed it politically. Well, he got elected. Then the Democratic Party called the first meeting of the Democratic delegates, and Adelaide Hart chaired it because she was Democratic vice chair, but they didn't include inviting Coleman Young because of this left attack on him. Well, Bob Billender was one of the leading black activists that really was for integration. He's a very good friend of Gus's and mine, tremendous person. He'd called Gus to say, well, Coleman wanted to be at the, and said, Gus said, and I said, well, why not? Well, he called Adelaide Hart and said, what about it? She said, well, you were elected? Yes. Well, am I going to second guess what the people in your district did? Of course you come. So the meeting's held. Adelaide had talked to me about it beforehand, so Coleman's there. So the first motion's made. I move that every Democrat was elected be welcome as long as they act like Democrats. Adelaide said, motion made, seconded, and passed. She didn't even have a vote on it. And Coleman Young played a very positive role in Con. He did a very good job and attended all the meetings, and it was very constructive. And I think that was the start of his revitalization.
Any other delegates stand on your mind? And how about John Hanna?
John Hanna was a very good delegate. John Hanna, I tell you, John Hanna's strength was an administrator, not the legislative process. He sat right next to me, and a kind of a humor that if a professor would get up to talk, he'd nudge me, Tom, and look at your eyes and say, well, there goes 45 minutes. That's the length of a class. And he was usually right. But John Hanna had a tremendous loyalty to the state of Michigan, and particularly MSU. And he got MSU equated with the U of M, that the 1908 Constitution talked about the university, the U of M. Well, none of that nonsense when John Hanna was there. So he was a very good delegate. We did, in debating on adoption of the Con, we had one meeting kind of interesting. So he came out for the apportionment plan, and I was on a debate and quoted him in Mississippi, where he was on the head of the Civil Rights Commission, saying the lack of apportionment was a problem in Mississippi. And I said, John, I think your liberalism is a square of the distance you're away from home. Well, he kind of was offended at that, but John was a very good delegate, an excellent president, and I think he's the one person that could have been elected governor or U.S. senator, but his heart was with MSU.
Well, as it turned out, the voters of the state of Michigan adopted the '63 Constitution by a very narrow margin.
Yes.
There may have even been a recount. Were you involved in that?
Yes, and I was not enthusiastic about that one. We'd had a meeting, Gus Scholl and I think it was Roy Ruther, and there's somebody, Quayle, one of these great pollsters, said we should turn around and support it. Well, Gus was adamant on it. See what happened on apportionment. Ted Sachs felt, and I think he was right, that if we voted for any change from one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, the U.S. Supreme Court might say, well, you got a constitutional right to give away your birthright. On the other hand, Bob Danoff and I have talked about this very candidly. The Republicans felt if there was any giving, Detroit would have taken over the state of Michigan. Well, you've heard Bob and me on panels, we were both wrong, that the population shift after Con was from Detroit to Kent County in western Michigan. The U.S. Supreme Court decided things. They didn't care what the state's legislatures had done. They stuck with the one person, one vote. So we were both wrong on that.
And your old friend Joe Kowalski got elected as Speaker in that election. Tell us about Joe.
Well, Joe was an amazing person. I think I told you I was his deputy on the old WPA Workers' Service. Joe had a real feeling for people. He couldn't write well at all. I had to do all his writing. Then when he was Speaker, he had Dick Miller do his reading for him. Now, Joe had a guts feeling for things. I helped do the maneuvering to getting the votes to be Speaker. and he was an excellent speaker. And people thought of him as a Polish Catholic. When he appointed committee assignments, he got more blacks chair of committees than had ever been done before. The ones that were shortchanged were women when we elected those 21 at large. And Joe did a very good job. The one thing he did in particular, he never got credit for it. There was always a concern of the power of lobbyists. Well, he got the Ford Foundation to give money to hire people to do staff work. Some of them are still around. Phil
Frangos?
Phil Frangos was one. So there are a lot of people that started that way, and Joe did a tremendous job that way. That I remember in those days, and if you want to know, it was in a bill, John Lovett had come up to and say, "Well, Tom, don't ask them, ask me. I put the bills in." And at that time, the senators had 4 staff people, the Democrats. The Republican in the House, the members didn't have their own offices. So you could see a person a half hour after the session closed. Well, my good friend John Lovett, if see somebody talking to Gus, he'd go to the fellow and say, "Look, sorry talking to Gus Shaw. I don't think the boys back home will like that." That was one warning. Second time, sure enough, the boys back home heard about it. Gus said that talking to a legislator, said, "Well, see me calling up to the room after," they're like telling a guy to come around to a house of prostitution or something. But Joe opened up the legislative process. Now, maybe it was overspent, but he got the technical staff so legislators could rely on their staff people rather than on the lobbyists, and that's never been brought out sufficiently.
Tom, in 1966, George Romney swept a victory over Zoltan Ferenczi and brought back almost, brought in a 55-55 tie in the State House. Give us a story of what happened to E.D. O'Brien.
Well, E.D. O'Brien, I guess, got a trip down to the Caribbean. And Joe had been very sympathetic to E.D. O'Brien. It hurt Joe. Joe had this massive, his office was downgraded. He had it was a massive heart attack. He never recovered. And in fact, I got his workers' comp on the basis that it's not more work, it was less work. And you might talk to Bob Waldron about this. I don't want to do the gossip, but I think when he wanted the second trip, he didn't get the second trip. But
so he abstained, and Bob Waldron became the speaker.
Yeah, and Bob Waldron became, and Bob and Joe were good friends. Bob Waldron did a good job. I mean, I'm not critical of Bob. He did a very good job. I think that, I'm disappointed in E.D. O'Brien.
After Gus Scholl retired, you began looking at the private sector and went into private law practice.
Yeah.
And your principal area of activity, besides doing legislative work, was also in the area of election law.
Yeah.
And I remember first hearing about you, Tom, as the person who basically was involved in the longest running recount campaign in American history in New Hampshire between Wyman and Durkin.
Yeah.
Any other recount campaigns?
Well, I think a lot of fascinating ones was the one in Oregon with Wayne Morse. It's about 3 in the morning. We knew we'd lost. We're talking just like you and I said, "Well, Senator, what do you need to be a senator? You know, lawyer, dean?" No. But I said, you need someone that wants to be elected but doesn't have to be elected.